Thank you very much for coming. I welcome you on behalf of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy here in the Diplomatic Academy. Usually it would be Werner Fassland to welcome you here, but this time Werner is out of town and he asked me to step in for him. I cannot be a real replacement for Werner, but I will still try. And I hope that I will, get you and us all through this evening, through a very interesting evening. And we all are already some elderly people, so we look back. In history and to look back to the year 1989, when Austria applied for membership in July for the European Union. And we were, before our Finnish and Swedish friends. Sweden, if I'm not mistaken, applied for membership also in July or June 1991. And Finland took a little bit longer to decide, and it was also in spring 1992. So Austria was ahead of these two countries when applying for membership. We joined, as we all know, together, and we joined, in our understanding, as the three neutrals. And but on the way after, joining from 1995 afterwards, the Finnish and Swedish policies changed. Gradually, for us Austrians, we still thought there are these three neutrals who are in the European Union, and we're all together. But for Sweden and for Finland, it became non-alignment and not anymore neutrality. The political geography changed after 1991. We all know that after 1989. For us especially, no Iron Curtain anymore. We became the center of Europe. The Soviet Union fell apart. And between Vienna and Moscow was not anymore 60 kilometers, as we felt that the Iron Curtain, but it was really more than 2,000 kilometers. And in between, we had Czech Republic, Poland, Belarus, and then Moscow. So for us, the landscape changed completely. For Finland and Sweden, it was a little bit different. Finland kept its long border, not anymore with the Soviet Union, but when you applied for membership, it was already the Russian Federation, and not anymore the Soviet Union. And Sweden still had, opposite of Sweden, on the other side of the Baltic Sea, whatever you call it, an enclave, an exclave, Kaliningrad. So your perspectives became different than ours. And I think this is what we have also experienced in the past years and decades, that we have, although thought that we are all three neutrals, that actually the perspectives, the political geography for us has become a different one. And now, after the war started in Ukraine, Finland and Sweden decided to join NATO. And for us, this is certainly a very interesting step that somehow, at least in some circles of Austria, led to the fact that we started to wake up. What has happened and what is going on around that these two countries change and opt for membership in NATO. And how this all came about, we will hear tonight. I'm very pleased to have here as a guest speaker Her Excellency Pirkko Hämäläinen, the distinguished ambassador of Finland in Austria, and also to the UN, as well as Helena Zimmerdahl, the Minister-Counsellor from the Swedish Embassy in Vienna. And I'm very pleased to also have my former colleague in the ministry, Franz Cede, our distinguished international lawyer, to also present here the perspective of Austria. And myself, my name is Martin Sajdik. I'm a member of the board of the Austrian Institute. I will first give the floor to Her Excellency, Ambassador Hämäläinen. I try to recall now your curriculum vitae shortly, and if I make some mistakes, please correct me. You graduated from Turku University, social sciences, and at the end of the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, entered the foreign ministry. In the foreign ministry, you seem to have liked Austria because it is your second time that you are in Austria. I think the same is true for our Swedish colleague. There must be some positive side on Austria. So that is also that you are here for the second time. But you also had been ambassador, madam, to Latvia. And you had worked in Iceland and also for the UN. But for us, we also know very well what it means to have an important position in the administration of a ministry. Madam Ambassador was Chief of Personnel, and she was Undersecretary for Administrative Counsellor, Financial Protocol, so a very key position. And after this position, you decided to come back to Vienna. We are very pleased that you do so, and I will then introduce Helena Zimmerdahl when she will come and speak, and Franz then also afterwards. So, Madam Ambassador, please come.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you for a very kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me this evening. I think we are living the times where also we Finns are a little bit amazed at how things can happen very quickly when they start to go forward. So I'm concentrating in my presentation on how Finland changed its security policy and how we got to the conclusion that we want to be member in NATO. So that's the idea. I don't explain anything more about Finland, but show you it on the map, because it's a very Arctic country, together with Sweden and Norway and Russia, in fact, so that we are there at the highest corner of Europe. Already we heard a little bit about the history of Finland and our choices, and you know, during the Cold War, it was a very conscious decision that we decided to be neutral. We decided to stay out of any conflicts or any kind of problems between two different camps, and that was until 1991 our leading policy of our security and foreign policy. But then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it became very quickly clear that we need to consider our security policy. And like it was already very well put that Finland was the third one in row after Austria and Sweden and decided to apply the membership in the European Union. And that, in fact, made for us already a big change. That the day when we became a member in the European Union, we felt that that is already politically so binding that we can't anymore use the neutrality as our dominating feature of our security policy. And that was the day when we changed our formal foreign and security policy term to non-aligned country. And since then we have been, until this year, we have defined ourselves as a non-aligned country. We felt pretty much that being a part of the political union, European Union, was already giving us such a position that we were not neutral anymore. That was our interpretation. NATO option is interesting because it has been since 1990s in Finnish security strategy, written there. And I was just today, I was speaking with my colleagues at the embassy, and we were recalling that at some point we were saying that, you know, once again we write down this NATO option here, but it doesn't mean anything because it has been there already almost 20 years, but we wrote it down because it was still one of the options all the time. So you find it there since 1990s. And if you think about how the Finns were positioning themselves when it comes to the NATO membership, it was very clear that the membership didn't get more than maybe 28% was the highest rate for the membership, but it was, I show you later on, it was quite a low number of percentage for a long time. And then again, those who were against, there was clearly almost all the time over 60% of Finns against the NATO membership. But 24th of February changed everything, one can say. It happened very quickly. And why the mindsetting of Finns changed so rapidly and so, well, it was really something that I have never experienced in my home country before, that big change. And there are here some of the reasoning why people changed their mind and why it happened in a very, very speedy way. So first of all, Russia's objective was to question Ukraine's sovereignty and still is. And that was quite, let's say, amazing thing, because we Finns thought that once you question the sovereignty of Ukraine, when do you question the sovereignty of Finland then? I mean, suddenly the basis kind of dropped, the floor disappeared on our thinking what the neighbor can do or want to do. So, and also, of course, that Ukraine had some desires to integrate itself to the West. So that was clearly one of those triggering things which was given by Russia. And then what it meant was the really humanitarian emergency and migration crisis. And still today we can see the situation. And how we read the Russian approach was that they want to increase the influence in the former Soviet territory. And it sounded very alarming to Finns. Maybe also what was the clearest is that the second point here in my slide, and it's that Russia, the range of the Russian instruments was that they were ready to use a military means, military force, in order to pursue their political goals. And that is maybe the kind of the hardest part of that to realize that this can happen. And what it led to was that the UN Charter was violated because it prohibits all forms of threat or force. And the last thing here, which is still today a big question mark, is that Russia stated and has meanwhile also stated that the nuclear weapons could be used in a situation where they feel that the existence of Russia is threatened. What we have noticed, and we live in that today, is that the security of Europe and the security of Finland has really affected by the war which Russia started. And we can see how the security situation in Europe and including Finland, it is very serious at the moment and very difficult to predict than at any time, in fact, since the Cold War. And yeah, if we think about the consequences, we are still in the middle of the war, and it's so difficult to assess what's going to happen. And of course, that means that in the end, the confidence in Russia, as for example, I just took it as a trading partner, has deteriorated. We have sanctions, we have now almost closed the border so that the very few Russians can come to Finland. So the situation is really dire. So, but what happened in Finland? I referred to that until this year, majority of Finns were against to become a member in NATO, and that was very typical approach for Finnish parties since 1991. The NATO membership was not really on agenda, and but like I said, the NATO option was there. And when Treaty of Lisbon was negotiated and the Article 42.7 was written, Finland was one of the countries with Austria who wanted this small sentence at the end of it. And that's interesting, in fact, because I wanted to see how we see that today. And I noticed that for Finland, the game changer was in fact the terror attack in France, in Paris. Because when France asked, based on this article, help from other member countries, the article really turned concrete and operational. And from that on, one can see in Finland we started to talk about that this article is in fact giving us responsibility to act if it needs to be, if some country asks for help from others. So it kind of turned the discussion in Finland. But if you look at the parties, the moderates or the Conservative Party in Finland was the first one who started to support the NATO membership, and this happened around 2006-2007. The others, they had supporters who were for the membership and who were against, but officially no other party really didn't come out supporting this idea. But then something happened, and you can see here very well what happened. There are very small marks, but from 2002, you can see that how the polls concerning the people's mind and support for the NATO membership has really developed. So those who are for the NATO membership are those who are on blue, written in blue. Those who are against, they are grey, and they are there. You know, these polls are showing that over 60%, a long time, people were against. And then when we come to the 2022, that is where 28% of Finns were for, and then suddenly it goes up over 60%. So it tells so clearly that how changing the people's minds just took a day or two in Finland. And here you can see the results of the general polls, first in February, where we had close to 60% for the membership, then in March, where it was already over 60%, and in May it was already closer to 80%, 75 or something like that. And then the last one, where there is a 17th of May, that was the voting in the parliament, and 188 parliamentarians voted for the NATO membership, and only 8, if I recall correctly, were against. And those who were against the NATO membership were from the left-wing party mainly. Some of the center party also, but that shows very well how strong and clear support for the membership was. And even because of that, our public discussion was so vital or so active in Finland that we used to say, for example, 10 years ago, that if we join the NATO, we need to have referendum. But now what happened was that the people in Finland started to come up with their opinions to support this idea. And in fact, the parties were the ones that they dragged on board, that the parties, they have to take a stance and they have to decide. So that it went interesting way, that people were very loud and we had very active discussions and debates in Finland last spring. So that led to the point where the government decided to make a report on security. It was given to the parliament, and the debate took place in parliament. And after that, after debate, it came back to the government, who once again took this initiative to join the NATO or leave the application to the parliament, and then the voting took place. And same day, the government signed the application. So everything went in a good order, but very quickly in the end, if we think about the 20 years until that moment, we had talked about the NATO option. So it's really interesting. And if you ask today from Finnish people that did you do the right thing, 95% at least, 99% maybe would say that this was a definitely right thing to do. So, but we wanted to have Sweden with us, and that was clear. But at this time we had a leading role, whereas when we joined the European Union, Sweden had clearly the leading role. But we felt that it's important to go together and do it together. So that's why that was the idea. So you probably know the steps which have been taken. The accession protocol was signed in Madrid after Madrid when that decision was made by the NATO conference, and then now the ratification process takes place, and we know that 28 countries out of 30 have already ratified. And finally, I'm little by little coming to the end, but I want to say something about that how we think that what Finland can bring to NATO. And we have a long history, in fact, like Austria does in conflict prevention and peace mediation. For example, we have had 50,000 peacekeeping soldiers in our history, which is quite a good number. We want to contribute to global stability and peace mediation, and also we want to make a strong contribution in cyber defense. In Finland there is a hybrid, we call it hybrid center, but it's concentrating on the hybrid threats, and it's also kind of a partner to cyber defense questions. And then the Finnish model of security is the comprehensive security. That's in fact a close cooperation between authorities, private sector, social society, organizations, academia, and private citizens. So it's not only the military part, but it's also the whole society and how the society can be resilient and cooperate effectively when needed. And of course, we bring to NATO strong national defense, and we think that in many different ways we are a security provider to the NATO. But of course, we are also a user of security which is provided by NATO. The collective defense and Article 5 in the end is very important for Finland today. So that's my short introduction, and I'm looking forward to have a discussion, but I thank you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. That was really fascinating. Thank you very much also for this PowerPoint presentation, very clear PowerPoint presentation. I have to say that although I thought I've been following Finnish politics for quite a while attentively, it skipped my attention that already in 1990 you had NATO as an option. And ever since this is a really interesting aspect that I think many in Austria might have overlooked this, and that I think is important to notice. And then also, you know, the very fascinating development of public opinion. Obviously, it's clear with the war and with your how many thousand kilometers? 2,000 kilometers of border?
1,340 kilometers
of border.
To be exact.
To be exact. Well, so this is really. I mean, if you have a border like that, then you know what kind of neighbor you have, and that is for sure. And also, I think it is also interesting for us that you pointed out what you bring to NATO. And not only your own strong defense and security, but you also bring mediation. Yes, you have your mediation capacities. You have the Ahtisaari initiative, CMI. You have, if I'm not mistaken, even a department now in your ministry for mediation. So these are aspects that one should not overlook. So you come not only as a, so to say, with a military element, but you come also with a peace-building element, and I think and this is important to understand. Now we turn to Helena Zimmerdahl, the Minister-Counsellor from the Swedish Embassy. Thank you also for coming. Zimmerdahl has studied in Stockholm and in Lund. She graduated in Lund. Journalism and political science. You joined the foreign ministry in 1997, is that correct? And then you were posted in Jerusalem and in Vienna, good. But then you made a very interesting step in your career. You left the foreign ministry I did that too for quite some time in the ministry again and again, but came back. And you did the same. You went as the head of communication for the city council, city administration of Landskrona, not Landskron near Villach, but Landskrona, which is, I think, opposite Denmark. And you learned how to work with public opinion. And I think that's a very interesting and important element. You also were then for 2 years in Brussels at your representation of your mission at the European Union. And now you're again with us. So thank you very much. Please, Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Cede. Let's see if I can transport myself. And as a representative of Sweden, it's always very good in these contexts to come after Finland, because the Swedish process of applying for NATO membership for sure began in Finland. But when we discussed and prepared a little bit, what can our embassy or Sweden bring to this discussion, and then I thought I'll start with, as you also did in your introduction, Ambassador, there are similarities between Sweden and Austria. Not only did we join the EU at the same time, but also for the sake, both for Sweden and Finland, but most things relate to both countries, but I will say Sweden for the simplicity of it. We have a long-standing neutrality. When you in Austria say you've been neutral for so long, I say 200 years. And this has been a synonym for us with our self-identification in the world. I'm not saying our neutral status was always glorious, but it was there. And as late as in January 2022, this non-alignment was reconfirmed by the foreign minister in our parliament in the biannual foreign policy debate in January. And as in Austria, I would also say another similarity is that we haven't had an active public debate about NATO membership. We have had one and then two parties in parliament who've been pro, but this has not been a discussion that anybody has really been ready to invest in. The political party in parliament with the longest record being pro-NATO is the Liberal Party, equivalent on the EU level, I would say, with NEOS. They both belong to ALDE, or this Reformed Europe group on the European level. Then the Conservatives, the EPP, came. But up to a year ago, these were the two parties in parliament that were pro-NATO, but there was no discussion. So I would say these two things are quite similar between Sweden and Austria, and not so similar with Finland. But there are also differences. As Ambassador Hämäläinen said, when we joined the EU, we also realized we can no longer be neutral, we are non-aligned. In practice, this was not a significant change. There was no NATO option on the table. But what we did do is slowly, since we joined Partnership for Peace within the NATO framework, we had vast and incremental increase of NATO cooperation. And this was by no means secret, but it was not really in the focus of the public debate. I can describe these steps later. And the third difference between Sweden and Austria when it comes to why we applied for NATO membership, but you not, I would say you do not have Finland as a neighbor and your best friend. I don't only mean that you went ahead of us, but we have a common geography, we have a common history. We drew the same conclusions. But after that, then came February 24th and Russia's large-scale aggression against Ukraine. And the Swedish politicians, the government and the opposition immediately realized that this has structural and long-term implications and that means deterioration of the security policy in Europe. So the first step before we started actually discussing NATO membership, and this is in January, February, early March this year, the government decided to increase the spending on the national defense to reach the 2% goal, by the 2% of the GDP. The biggest increase since the 1950s. And the goal is, this has to do with absorption capacity, of course, but 2026, 27, 28 is when we think that the 2% goal can be reached. The armed forces also decided to re-establish a regiment on the island in the Baltic Sea, Gotland, and in order to reactivate our defense capacity. This is, of course, an unsinkable ship in the Baltic Sea. In parallel with these defense reinforcements, there was, as Ambassador Hämäläinen said, intense discussions between the Swedish and the Finnish government. And the Finnish government strongly influenced the Swedish. We didn't have the same debate as you had. It didn't really come from under. We had a couple of political parties who were pro, and in the end, all four parties on the right-hand side of the middle were pro. So the real exciting experience is what happened within the Social Democratic Party. So the second step, first, the government decided to increase defense spending. The second step was, on March the 16th, the government decided to set up a parliamentary working group to address the implications of the war in Ukraine. This was led by our former foreign minister since yesterday, the Social Democrat Mrs. Ann Linde. Our defense minister also participated in these talks. And they were cross-parliamentary. All 8 parties of parliament were present and took part in these deliberations, and they had all in all 6 meetings. They started meeting in March, and the end report was issued mid-May. To cut it short, I can read out the conclusion of this. For Sweden, the primary effect of NATO membership would be that Sweden would become part of NATO's collective security and be covered by the security guaranteed enshrined in Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. This was the conclusion. 6 out of 8 parties in Parliament supported it. The other 2, the Greens and the Left, supported the first chapters, namely the analysis, but they did not support the conclusion. And now you may ask in Austria what happened to Article 42.7 in the Lisbon Treaty. Yes, Sweden looked into this. This was, in fact, the government's first option. I don't know if you remember, but I think it was the European Council in February, an informal European Council, where Sweden actually suggested this. Let's look into Article 42.7. So, of course, the parliamentary group investigated this, but what they found out is there is no political will among the EU member states to change this state of affairs, nor do the EU member states on their own have the military capacity required in this context. It can therefore be concluded that the conditions for a shift towards collective defense within the EU are lacking. And with this, Sweden went forward with an application. I don't know if I have time for this. I can come back to this if you want to. The steps that Sweden started taking in 1994 within the Partnership for Peace, going all over to enhanced opportunities partnership in 2014. In 2016, Sweden signed a host country agreement with NATO, etc., reinforcing the interoperability, changing to English language in the command structure, etc., making us as compatible as possible with the NATO structures without being in them. And I already mentioned that the two parties, if you look at a year ago, we had 4 parties who were pro-NATO membership. the Moderate Party, Centre Party, Christian Democrats and ALDE. 4 were against: the Greens, the Left, Social Democratic Party and the Sweden Democrats. But the Social Democratic Party and the Sweden Democrats have turned. And you also mentioned that you wanted to know the Swedish opinion on NATO. And of course, it's possible to find data, but not as easy as in Finland. And I think the reason is it was never discussed to the extent that it was in Finland. But I have found a chart. I wish I'd done a nice PowerPoint for you, but I haven't. But it's been 1994, the support for a NATO membership was roughly 15, 16, 17%. And these are these 2 parties that I mentioned. And it lies like this, maybe up to 25, differing 15 to 25 different years, until 2014, the invasion of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. And since then, it raised to 38% and then dipped to 33%, etc. And last year, it was 29%. So you can see the pressure of joining NATO is not a people's project. From us, it was a top-down. It was the political parties who realized, what do we do with this? What do we do with the fact that Finland, the pure motivation of us staying out of NATO, what do we do? So it was more, I would say, a top-down approach. But it is not controversial, because you might think that people would feel overturned or so. No, this is, it hasn't been, when the parties have switched opinion, the voters have followed. And interestingly enough, we just finished the parliamentary elections and election campaign, and since the decision to apply for NATO membership was taken in May, some months before the parliamentary debates began, it was off the table. It was hardly mentioned. Of course, the war was mentioned in the respect of a difficult environment and difficult political situation, but this is now a new fact that's been established. Yes, and I think this is where I will stop, and I look so much forward to questions and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very precise and clear picture from Sweden. We all now learn what it means to have Finland as a neighbor, to have Finland as an influential neighbor, and to have this top-down approach that has been so important in Sweden. And I think it was also important that when you said the key was the change of the Social Democrats, in Finland, if I'm not mistaken, you have a Social Democratic Prime Minister, and you had a lady Prime Minister also in Sweden. And one can think that these 2 ladies might have communicated and talked to one another. And I think this made then this important, difference and for the change in Sweden. And certainly, geography is definitely always plays a role. But I think both countries, unlike Austria, don't depend so much on Russian gas as we do. And you have your different sources, and you have had a much different policy in this respect, other than us Austrians. To speak about Austria, we have Franz Cede. Franz, to present Franz to those who are here, I mean, so many people here know Franz, but for those who don't know Franz, Franz Cede is certainly one of the most eminent Austrian international lawyers, experts on international law. He had studied in Innsbruck, and then afterwards at the School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, both in Bologna and in Washington. You joined the Foreign Ministry in '72, and you had a very interesting career. You both served in developing countries. You served in in Congo, Zaire, in Kinshasa. You were in Morocco, but also posting in developed countries. So you had a very interesting balance, which is very good for diplomacy. You had been ambassador to Moscow from 1999 to 2003, and afterwards from 2003 to 2007 to Belgium and NATO. I think you presented your credentials still to Yeltsin, not to Putin.
Yes.
Because Putin became president only on
just before he resigned.
On the 31st of December,
yes.
1999. So they started the year 2000 very interestingly with Putin. So you have this special Moscow perspective, but what I also have to mention, and it is so important, he was the head for 6 years of our international law office in the foreign ministry, in the tradition of which keeps very much the tradition of very prominent Austrian international lawyers like Verosta and Nettel, and you are, so to say, in this tradition. And Franz, please, now we will hear the Austrian perspective.
Thank you very much for Martin for these kind words of introduction. Please forgive my professional background as a lawyer. When I'm going to put the focus of my thoughts on the legal side of what were the old and the new perspectives of European security. Of course, when we look a little bit in the past, before, I would say, the breakdown of the Iron Curtain, Austria, together with Sweden and Finland, in important international organizations such as OSCE, United Nations, but also in the framework of the Partnership of the Peace Program, we were known as the core group of the so-called neutral and non-aligned countries, trying our best, making our best efforts to contribute to international mediation and to the search for peaceful solutions to crises and conflicts all over the world. This was the time when Finland was great names coming from Finland, like Martti Ahtisaari, entered the world arena as peacemaker. Earlier, Bruno Kreisky from Austria made an input on international mediation and search for peace. I especially like to mention Kreisky's contribution to the settlement or the search for a settlement in the Middle East conflict, and not to forget Sweden with Dag Hammarskjöld as Secretary General of the United Nations, or well known in Vienna, Hans Blix, who used to be the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and also one of the most eminent international lawyers of the world. This was the past. This era of, I would call it, neutral diplomacy gradually came to an end well before the 24th of February this year. And I would like to recall briefly the steps which, in my view, contributed to, let's say, putting a distance between the concept of neutrality, the traditional concept of neutrality, on the way to the concept of solidarity and mutual assistance as we have it now in Article 42 of the Lisbon Treaty. So I think the gradual development of our countries, Austria, Sweden and Finland, from the concept of neutrality in an expansive interpretation to solidarity started when Austria and Sweden and Finland put their candidature for EU membership on the table, and in the framework of the accession treaty, our three countries had formally underwritten a declaration which was attached to the accession treaty that outlined that our countries were able and willing, without any reservation, to fully participate in the common foreign and security policy of the European Union. This is part of the legal package which was the beginning of our joint membership in 1995 in the European Union. I think a second important step on this road from neutrality to mutual assistance and cooperation in the EU framework was certainly the adoption and entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, where in the Lisbon Treaty you have the famous Article 42 that creates a clause of mutual assistance comparable to Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. And this famous Article 42, in the negotiations, I remember, at that time it was Benita Ferrero-Waldner who was our foreign minister. She was very nervous in the negotiations whether Austria could agree to this provision of Article 42.7, which installs a mutual assistance clause. And she called me up late in the evening asking me whether this is compatible with our concept of neutrality, etc. And she thought that she could not agree to this clause of mutual assistance. And in the course of the negotiations, the Irish clause was introduced as a kind of compromise, as a kind of bridge to help the neutral countries to swallow the toad of mutual assistance. And this was the famous Irish clause. As far as the neutral states are concerned, it's not the Irish clause relating to the NATO countries, which were explicit in pointing to the Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, stating in no uncertain words that for NATO member states, which are at the same time members of the European Union, the NATO maintains to be continues to be the foundation of security and of the guarantee of territorial independence and sovereignty. So we have the two sides in Article 42, one that accommodates the neutral countries, Sweden and Finland, Ireland at the time, and at the same time the NATO member states, which insisted that NATO obligations, commitments for them were the foundation of their collective security. And with this, I would say, ambivalent outcome of the Treaty on the European Union of Lisbon, we are now faced with a double face legal construction on EU's security guarantees. And when, and this is perhaps the latest step, which I want to illustrate, when Sweden and Finland decided to join NATO, they made it 100% clear to each and everyone, even those who didn't want to hear it, that for Sweden and Finland, the security guarantee of the Washington Treaty had that they put all their trust and confidence in the Washington Treaty of founding treaty of NATO, rather than the EU's assurance of mutual assistance as enshrined in Article 42. This was, I think, the lesson we have learned after this 24th of February, which unfortunately was also my birthday, or is my birthday. But this is the date which is a watershed in world affairs. Everything what we were used to accept as a permanent certainty of European and world security architecture collapsed. And we are now facing a completely new international security environment. And my fear is that Austria, unfortunately, at least as far as the wider public is concerned, has not yet understood this dramatic time change, in the words of Chancellor Olaf Scholz when he spoke about the time change. I think he used the right word, and when he announced that Germany would invest more than 1 billion of euros for defense purposes, something unheard of in Germany before. You remember during the Trump administration, when Germany was cornered by the Trump administration for not doing enough in terms of defense spending, in terms of its contribution to security, etc., etc. This was before the 24th of February 2022. I could go on and talk about for hours about our topic today, but we will have an interesting discussion later on. But just let me allude to the public debate which is, in my sense, missing in Austria, and which you have had in Sweden and in Finland. I'm sure if we had, if one were to organize a referendum, even today in Austria, whether on the issue whether Austrian neutrality should be maintained or not, I'm sure that in spite of the fact that we live in a completely different security environment, a majority of the population would speak in favor of maintaining neutrality, as it looks like in my assessment. You have a present chancellor of this republic who went on record saying that Austria was a neutral country, still is a neutral country, and will continue to be a neutral country in the future, thereby trying to cut short a public debate on the security policy of Austria under the changed international circumstances. And I really do believe that it is very important that there should be such a debate, and this is why, together with former Minister of Defense Friedhelm Frischenschlag, who is in the room, we signed a petition to the President of this Republic to trigger a public debate on Austria's security in the light of the newest developments. Let me stop at this point in time. I would like to reserve the rest of my opinions for the discussion. I thank you very much for giving me the privilege to be here and to participate in this wonderful evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Franz. I think we've heard, was speaking about Article 42.7. Maybe you could help us. It would be interesting for maybe the audience also. We prepared this here. You can read it in English. There is a German version too. And you call it, we just took out paragraph 7 on the mutual defense clause, so that you maybe, I guess, quite a number of you read this clause for the first time. And that is telling, and I think everyone here in the room should ask oneself, have I read it before? You spoke about also the change in attitude, Franz, but there is also one interesting change in attitude that we have forgotten to at least mention, and that is the referendum in Denmark on the 1st of June of this year. And the Danes opted, decided in this referendum with a very also 65%, nearly 3/3 majority, to opt out from the Danish opt-out, which is really interesting, and to opt out only for the defense part of the opt-out. They have this opt-out of the Maastricht Treaty, where they have, that's why they don't have the euro, and they also mentioned the defense and military cooperation, and this they changed in the referendum. So, i.e., now not anymore applying the second phrase of 42.7. They, so to say, this shall not prejudice the specific character of the security and defense policy of certain member states, because they opted out from this. They returned and accepted indirectly this paragraph, and they will not be able to refer to this anymore. So we have, from my point of view in Austria, overlooked this referendum, because it could have been teaching us very much of why did the Danes do that. And there is no discussion at all in Austria of why did the Danes do exactly this. But maybe when you go home, you will try then to Google and look into what happened on the 1st of June in Denmark. Enough of my comments. Let me turn to our. You will have the chance to ask questions, but let me start with asking a question to the two of you, if I am allowed. You, Madam Ambassador, you specified that you have already 28 ratifications. There are 2 ratifications outstanding, and one ratification is Hungary, and the other ratification is Turkey. So 2 ratifications outstanding. And we know your discussions and the protocol that you have signed, especially Sweden with Turkey, this trilateral memorandum. I just repeated the defense industrial cooperation, the prosecution and financing and recruitment of prosecution of financing and recruitment activities linked to the PKK, and the establishment of a joint permanent mechanism. Now, my question to you goes: does this, has this mechanism already been established? How does the cooperation go? Were you anticipating in your countries that you might have problems in the ratification of your membership from the side of Turkey and from Hungary? And we all have to ask ourselves, okay, the Turks have at least explained why, but have the Hungarians so far explained? So where do you stand on this?
Maybe if I start, or When it comes to Hungary, our understanding is that in fact Hungary's parliament started its work in this month, and there are some legislation that they need to take first, that they are in a way in that sense emergency situation with this legislation. But we have been told, this is our understanding, that the ratification comes in its time. So it's there waiting for a parliamentary process, but it's there in the row of legislation. So this is our understanding when it comes to Hungary. We have started together with Sweden and Turkey discussions at the expert level, and my understanding is, what I hear from my capital is that these are very constructive discussions, and we believe that there is a possibility that by the end of the year also Turkey ratifies, but of course we need to see. I mean, our understanding is anyway that the clarifications and the discussions at the expert level have been successful, but maybe my Swedish colleague can comment on from your part, but that's the situation how I see from our part.
Yes. As far as, I mean, this is dealt with in a small circle. So the information disseminated to the embassies are on a need-to-know basis. This is the first thing I need to say. And another thing I want to mention is that when these negotiations with Turkey started, a Swedish state secretary, Oskar Stenström, was appointed. He was the state secretary of the former Prime Minister, Mrs. Magdalena Andersson, and this same person stays on the job for this special task, meaning that we want to signal continuity and that this is not, in Sweden, a bipartisan issue for struggle. So these, but when it comes to Hungary, I share your view. We don't know of any known objections from Hungary. We know that it takes time, but I have not read anywhere that this should signal an opposition or something. In my embassy also follows the Slovakian politics closely, and there it also took time, and it had absolutely nothing to do with their stand on the Swedish and Finnish applications. So all I can say on Hungary is there are no known objections. Turkey, of course, there are expectations from the Turkish side on Sweden and Finland, and to be honest, I think there are higher expectations on Sweden than on Finland in this. And I know that Sweden has explained and clarified legal changes that were already in the pipeline when it comes to anti-terrorism legislation. And this has been outlined and presented within this tripart working group. So how that is received on the other side, I don't know. I'm not hiding anything from you, I don't know. But we know that the group is meeting, and I've also heard the estimation maybe around the end of this year. But this is it's a cliche, but it's above my pay grade.
Well, if it is by the end of this year, this would mean still, a record ratification, because for Northern Macedonia, if I'm not mistaken, it took 21 months to then become a member. So that is a difference. Or the question is whether one would have to wait for the elections where now, at least they expect us so, not supposed to say anymore Turkey, but Türkiye. And so if the elections they will be in the end of June, beginning of July of next year. So if these if the elections, if one has to wait for this would then mean a much longer period, but one can only hope that this is not the case. I tend to fly Turkish Airlines now quite often in the past weeks, and when you get into Turkish Airlines, they have a very good, system in-flight entertainment. But at the beginning, you get a video where some wonderful, beautiful people then always tell you, "Welcome to Turkey, welcome to Turkey." So this is the way to learn that this is no more Turkey, but Turkey, and so that's another of these developments. Franz, let me ask you also a question. Then we will open for questions. Today, Roberta Metsola, the President of the European Parliament from Malta. Metsola is actually a Finnish name, right?
Yeah, she is married to a Finn.
She is married to a Finn. So I mean, she has, if I'm not mistaken, 4 children with the Finn, right? Good, all right. So Roberta Metsola came out with an interesting statement and I just quote a little bit out of this. She spoke about a need to create a real European security and defense union. And EU defense policy should not be there to compete with NATO, but rather complement it. I guess, Franz, you have also heard about this. What is your view on this?
As I like to read the EU Observer, today on the internet I read this statement. It's quite interesting development coming from a Maltese citizen. Anyway, she is the President of the European Parliament, and if you look at Article 42, not subparagraph 7, but paragraph 2, subparagraph 2 of 42, there's talk about a European defense, which is a programmatic pronouncement going in the direction of a development of the European common and foreign security policy towards the creation of a European defense. We all know that would require the approval of each and every member state of the European Union at the level of the European Council. And as nice as this statement by the President of the European Parliament reads, and I'm all in favor of it, I think it will not be easy for the time being to gather the unanimity of each and every member state of the European Union, not to talk about the complexities this goal entails, like does it also comprise the nuclear aspect of defense? If you look at the current composition of the European Union member states, there's only one country after the Brexit that has a nuclear defense element, and how this would enter the picture of a European defense union, it's very much an open question, and there are a lot of other questions, but I like the idea of going forward in the direction of a European defense union, which is, by the way, an expression not used in the treaties itself. So it is a kind of vague description of a goal which is on the table now. So this is my first comment on that, but it has been published today only, so it still needs some more serious study and examination.
Well, I agree with you. The interesting thing, it comes from a Maltese. And so the Maltese, like us, the Cypriots and the Irish, we are, so to say, the lonely ones now in the European Union. That's why it's interesting it comes from her. But one also has to mention that we don't know whether this is Maltese policy, because she comes from the opposition party in Malta. And so I don't know what the position of Prime Minister Abela will be on this, but still it's an interesting thought for still that one still speaks about this common European defense policy, and so to give life to Article 42. And that's why I guess it's really interesting. And I would also like to say that not only you and Minister Frischenschlager were the signatories of this letter, but I think you had 300, around 300 who signed this.
Yes,
letter.
yes.
So that is quite also important to mention. So please, do you have any questions? Alexander?
Thank you very much, Mark. I have a very brief question directed at my colleague Franz Cede. You mentioned the letter you have. Thank you. You mentioned the letter you have written to the federal president. Since I guess the letter was in the public domain, are you at liberty to tell us, did he respond to your letter? And if so, what did he say? And is it your impression that he would be willing to exert some pressure on the government to start a debate which you and others have intended? Thank you.
As I'm a retired ambassador, I'm free to say what I think. I'm under no...
There was a question from a retired ambassador to a retired ambassador. Okay?
I have no instructions, but what I can tell you, the letter was first sent to the president's office during the campaign for elections or presidential elections, which were held early in October, as you know, and it was not to be expected that during the campaign we would receive any substantial reply. So what came out from the office of the president was a kind of courtesy letter written by a subordinate employee of the staff of the president, acknowledging receipt and with some friendly formulations put around it, and that was it. And now the second part of your question was whether in the future the president will take a stand, a substantial position on what we consider a need for a public debate on the burning questions of European and Austrian security. I'm afraid to say that, as I know our revered president, he will be rather, I would say, hesitant, to put it mildly, to go on the front line of this debate. His background is from the Green Party. The Green Party in Austria is certainly among the political force that likes neutrality and certainly would subscribe the statement of Mr. Nehammer that Austria should remain neutral until the day of last judgment. That is my very personal view of the situation.
But we have seen the metamorphosis of Greens in Germany, right? I mean, so but whether there is an influence on the Austrian Greens, we don't know. Please.
My name is Paul Louis. I studied neutrality since the late 1970s. and wrote a book about the accession of Sweden, Finland, and Austria to the European Union. So I'm comparing these three countries all the time. What I realized already at that time in the 1990s and early 2000s, in Finland, the media and the scientists, political scientists, were very much open, more open, discussing neutrality or NATO membership. And so this practically never happened in Austria. We have a very bad press, qualitatively very bad press, and this open discussion, which I found in Sweden and Finland, I have never seen here in Austria. What in Austria never was debated was the opportunity costs of neutrality. Being neutral means that you're losing something, and the Austrians lost all the partners. Austria has no close cooperation partner in the European Union and beyond. In contrast to Sweden and Finland, they always had the Nordic cooperation, and this would be one of my first questions. How will Nordic cooperation develop now inside NATO? This is the thing. And what I realized, for instance, in the 1990s, Sweden and Finland participated already in the strategic airlift capability based in Papa in Hungary. The Austrians not. The Austrians are neighbors of Hungary, but they didn't participate in NATO's strategic airlift capability. And things like that go on, and you never had a real discussion about neutrality. The second point, besides this opportunity cost, is there was a publication in the early 2000s when two sociologists wrote about neutrality from a sociological point of view and said, in Austria, neutrality is always hiding nationalism. It's a very nationalist position. And they were right, because now the most national party in Austria, the Freedom Party, is the most supporter of neutrality, besides the Social Democrats and the Greens. But this was never debated, that neutrality also means...
Professor, may I ask you for your question?
Yeah,
I mean, it's important to discuss.
There's also one question I
it.
also ask you. The second question is, we can debate the second question, what would Sweden and Finland do in NATO as NATO members? What are your aims? What would you support in the NATO activities?
Okay, so first question is, how does Nordic cooperation continue within NATO? And second question is, what in general will you do in NATO? Is that correct? I think, yeah. Okay, please.
Yeah, well, Finland and Sweden, we have cooperated very closely within NATO in the Partnership for Peace program, and also with the Nordic, other Nordic countries which are already in the NATO, and in the whole alliance in this framework and this context. So what we think is that now when also Finland and Sweden are in the NATO, the Nordic region of NATO will be strengthened in many different ways. But if I think the alliance as itself, I mean, we are for the alliance and alliance is for us. So we think that all the Nordic countries, from their own part, are also responsible for others. So that it's not like, that we are the kind of a Nordic group and trying to look only at ourselves, but it's cooperation within the NATO then that day that when we will be members. So I wouldn't put so that there is a kind of a Nordic stamp on it, but that comes to very, I think, very naturally, this cooperation in the region, Nordic region. What we are looking for in the NATO, of course, like I said, that we feel that NATO strengthens our defense policy. And what is important for us is the other capacity and the capability of NATO. Everything is formed together. So, and I think these are Article 5 is kind of giving us the backbone here in the future. So I couldn't really say that what are the ultimate goals for Finland otherwise operationally, other than that we want to develop our own defense capabilities. Our defense expenditure is 2% of the GDP, so, and it will be bigger in the coming years. So we want to be part of the NATO where we can provide, and we can also expect that we will be provided. So that's maybe the point. But if I at this point can add concerning the 42.7, because after the NATO application, this was taken up also in Finland, that do we now forget 42.7 in the European Union? And it has been quite clear message from the Prime Minister and from the government that we see that the European Union security and defense policy, developing it is our responsibility. It hasn't disappeared anywhere, and it hasn't gone to the background. It's still very important, and we want to develop it, and we want to be part of it. So the message is that we think that it's in the European Constitution, and as a member in the European Union, we need to put ourselves into take the next steps also in the defense policy of the European Union.
Well, thank you. That's a very interesting remark. Thank you very much. Please.
Yeah. To start with, what do we expect, or what? I mean, we are still an invitee, so of course this is said with all the reservations belonging to that. But no doubt, it is seen also in Sweden as a major reinforcement of the strategical and the operational defense of Northern Europe. But we also see it in connection with the Baltic states. I would say it's the Nordic-Baltic zone rather than just the Nordic, also given where the immediate potential threat might come from. And I think this is, I mean, since we've been so advanced in the Partnership for Peace status, it doesn't change so much, I would say, in the nearest future. But of course, it does allow for Sweden and Finland to take part in more long-term planning in this strategic and also operational defense. And what I understand, is that, of course, different countries have different strength. If I understand correctly, nothing beats the Finnish army. I don't think we can even compete with that. I think what Sweden might add would rather be Air Force or Navy as an added value. It would not, I think, be the army. But I'm sure there are people in here who can correct me and have the right data on this.
Well, thank you very much. I think it was also, it's important to also stress the Baltic dimension.
Yeah.
And with the developments that we see, for instance, now in Belarus and Russian moving into Belarus, I think the Baltic dimension will even have another, dimension. Christian. Please, then afterwards you.
Maybe before my short question, just a point of information as one of the signatories also of that letter. It did not only go to the President, but also to the Federal Chancellor and the President of Parliament, who were not in a particular campaign. No answer from those two either. My question to both of our guests, I think, is a very simple, or at the same time complicated one, and that regards the so-called interoperability of your military forces with NATO, or the NATO standard as it's called, which has not started with your membership application, but many years ago, if I'm rightly. informed. So the question is how that has developed and how that was being accompanied or not with public opinion. Thank you.
Please, maybe you start.
This is actually something I prepared, so thank you for this question. It hasn't been...
Did you talk to one another
No.
before?
How it has come across in the public opinion, it hasn't been so controversial because it's always been paired with the saying, it doesn't mean we're joining NATO. But what have we done? I can just run through it very quickly. It all started in 1994 when we were all, I think, invited to join the Partnership for Peace program. And in 1997, we became a member of the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, a forum for political dialogue, complemented with practical cooperation. And since the late 90s, the Swedish Armed Forces has increased its ability to work with NATO, adopting NATO standards, including English as operational language. This must be key. And we have also, as many here, participated in NATO-led operations in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq. And since 2013, Sweden has, based on our own planning as a partner country, taken part in NATO's most advanced collective defense exercises. So it's very incremental. And since when I was posted in Brussels, it was called the Gold Card, the Enhanced Opportunities Partnership to NATO. And this was as a direct response of the Russian invasion in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. And this already then involves a dialogue concerning the Baltic Sea region and intensified exchange on information between Sweden, Finland, and NATO. So you can see, as you say, we didn't start from scratch in May. And in 2016, we signed a host country agreement with NATO, being the base for exercises. And then we can also... And the side effect of that is also that we can more easily receive support from NATO in the situation in a crisis or a war, and it regulates what happens if foreign forces under NATO command are on Swedish territory. So more details than this I don't have, but as you can see, it's an almost 20-year-long path.
Maybe from our part, we follows it follows like what my colleague from Sweden has said. I think it went quite hand in hand also how our relationship has developed with the NATO.
It always has.
Yeah, and only one thing I recall, that in Finland we had a little bit a kind of, if not a debate in Parliament, I think that the Committee for Foreign and Security Affairs was not happy because this host country protocol was given information about it maybe one step later than the government should have done, and the problem wasn't the host country question, but because the information didn't reach the parliament early enough. But this interoperability has been one of the major efforts for Finland, and maybe it shows quite well now that when we are coming into the alliance in technical and military-wise, I think we don't need so much adjusting. It's more, I believe it's more in administrative and you know, the other things where we haven't been before within the alliance. So that's probably the biggest part. But our military has been in so close cooperation with the NATO troops that I can't see there, in fact, a lot to do for the moment. That's my understanding.
Mm. I'm changing the subject a little bit, but connected to this, having all this, we were quite embedded in the NATO structure, so to say. But it was also very striking for the Swedish politicians and also for us, the general public, what NATO General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg said about discussing no-fly zones, etc., that there is a difference if you're a member or not. And that this was, I think, for us a wake-up call. That we've been slightly, I mean, it hasn't really been a sharp situation until in February. And also realizing member or not member is a watershed. I think this was just something that we had to realize.
Yeah.
I've seen quite a number of hands up. That's good. So, you know, there will be wine served afterwards. So the longer we discuss here, the less wine you get. You just have to be aware of this. But please, let's continue. Now we have finally two ladies. Please, first. No, please.
Thank you very much for this very elucidating panel. First question to Madame Ambassadrice of Finland. You mentioned that few Russians are able to cross the border. Are you screening them whether they are Putin puppets or not, or from some other undercover operations? How are you handling these Russians, the few ones you let into the country? The question to the Swedish ambassadress. We have a long-standing history between Sweden and Austria, as we know from Olof Palme and Kreisky. When you are on Austrian turf, with your swiftness of mind, and you are doing things in a procedure of top-down, like the accession to NATO, what would you give as a consulting Swedish person to the Austrian mind to change the mindset? And as it's not possible to do it from top down, could you sort of recruit the down to go up to the top? And the last question is to Dr. Cede. Given the slumbering mentality of our nation and our population, and the non-responses of President, Chancellor, etc., and a Chancellor who almost prohibits to discuss neutrality further, question, are we still in a democracy or an autocracy in Austria? Thank you.
Well, here we are. Please.
Maybe I can start. We have diminished the number of incoming Russians to those who have relatives in Finland, who are studying in Finland, or on the humanitarian grounds. Basically, these are the reasons how to get to Finland, but we don't let tourists coming to Finland anymore. Of course, we can't guarantee that everybody who comes over the border is not Putin for Putin, but I think that already that we have squeezed the number for those who are able to come to Finland is affecting. And also, well, if you look at the situation before this happened, there were these young men who wanted to get out of the country. So I suppose that they are not pro-Putin people who really tried and wanted to come over to Finland. And we expected, and that has been, according to my understanding, has been also the trend that many of them continue to forward to other countries. But we have approximately 60,000 Russians living in Finland. They are, in fact, important in the workforce in Finland. So we can't say, that every Russian is pro-Putin. I mean, I believe that those who are living in Finland get the information, which is not under the propaganda of Russian authorities. So we believe in facts also.
And how many apartments and houses are owned by Russians in Finland?
There are quite many, especially in the eastern part of Finland. They usually have bought summer houses and I think that quite many last autumn started to buy apartments because they felt that they can't live in Russia. That has been, according to the interviews, that they felt that they have to leave their own home country because of the policy of Putin. So that is, I think some of the people have done this kind of purchases and bought some apartments. But in Finland, when it comes to the owning, for example, property or land, it's under the scrutiny of our military personnel. So nowadays, you can't buy just like that. 20 years ago, we were maybe one could say naive, that we thought that everybody who wanted to buy a land in Finland are most welcome. But now we have understood that you have to have also a security check when this kind of purchases have been done. So, for example, lately there was in fact one of the in Kotka region, which is at close to the eastern border, one of that such an property was declined from the Russian buyer. So it's happening now in Finland. Yeah.
Please.
As a guest in this wonderful country, you will never catch me on record for giving advice. So I will. But what I can say is that we can't underestimate the importance of the situation that the Swedish Social Democratic leader was, our Prime Minister was in February, March, and April, and May, with the environment as we knew it completely changing. And what she did, but this was not in a vacuum, it was all these movements around. She realized that we have to deal with this. This discussion cannot be postponed. But that was a completely different situation to what you have here, completely. But in that moment, the Social Democratic Party did a 180-degree U-turn, and we have to acknowledge that they did this without a split party and without huge convulsions in society and without even having it on the table in the election campaign. And this is good political craftsmanship, I would say.
By the way, to the signatories of this letter, did you address the letter also to the head of the chairwoman of the Social Democratic Party and to other parties?
Perhaps Minister Frischenschlager is able to respond to that question.
He passes on. Please.
Thank you very much for your explanations of the Finnish and Swedish position. It's really, I can admire it as you handled it. Yeah, this letter, the intention of this letter is to open up minds in Austria to discuss this issue. There are about 100 people now, and they come from different parties, different positions, and so on. The discussion we want to trigger, let's say. Of course, as Ambassador Cede mentioned, it went to, or you mentioned it, to all the political parties and so on. We didn't get an answer so far. But it doesn't matter. During this campaigning period, I think it was better not to discuss it because the federal president would be in a bad situation to confess he is, of course, pro-neutrality, and then he would be fixed. I think this is better that we didn't stir up too much the discussion in this period. But now we will continue, and it takes time, of course. And just to come back to the opinion polls, I would like to remind you, I think it's about 10 years ago, there was an opinion poll in Austria asking, are you in favor of neutrality? And there were the usual 70-75% in favor. in the same opinion poll was asked, would you like more European defense policy? And the result was almost the same percentage was in favor of European defense. So you see there is a total misunderstanding about the whole story in the public opinion in Austria. So I think we have to start this discussion. Then there could be a chance that the public opinion would change. And this is our intention. It takes time. In the meantime, I think there are also positive aspects. I'm surprised how strict the Austrian government is in favor of the European approach to the Ukrainian-Russian war. This is very clear that there is no neutrality. Politically, there is a strong position in favor of, on the side of the Ukraine. Military is different, but it doesn't matter. This is not our strong part in the whole development. But what is needed, that we, and this would be a question to you. United States are not mentioned in this discussion so far. And I think the most changing aspect of the development in the last 2-3 years is the situation how the United States can be estimated in its future policy to the European security. I think this is very important, and therefore what we should consider how to strengthen the European defense policy in its own responsibility. I think this is the most important aspect. And I think, of course, the question there is NATO and the common foreign and security policy. This is, of course, a special issue in this context. But I think we have to develop the European capacity of military instruments. And this is most important. Therefore, the Swedish and the Finnish policy in this is so important. To strengthen these European military capacities. This is very important. And we, as Austrian, we can contribute as well. And what you mentioned, the interoperability, I think this is the very, very important point in this all. If we name our situation and our position as Austrians as neutral, as far as we participate in this interoperability and in this integration of the military capacities in Europe, this is the main point. And then we can see how the structure of this cooperation, NATO and common security and defense policy, can be developed. But this is not the big problem.
Thank you. We have to return to the questions, please. Peter? Thank you, by the way.
I have two questions.
Minister
one to Franz.
Thank you very much for your statement.
Two questions, one to Franz, and then the second question to our ladies, friends and diplomats from the Scandinavian countries. One thing is clear, Franz. We don't share the bottom-up or top-down way to join NATO. Our way is completely different and more arduous. Particularly, we have to change our constitution. It's a 2/3 majority. It doesn't need a referendum, and it doesn't need a plebiscite. We need to change our constitution once we have the feeling that it is mature and the time has come. My question to the Scandinavian guests is, you have some difficulties with Turkey, as I understand, and you have sent your application for admission. And I'm sure you're not waiting till the other members will give you a notice of their ratification that you are still working and cooperating and negotiating behind the scene. We would like to know how far this has gone with the United States. They have elections. The Senate is so important for ratification. And I would also like to know how far Italy is after this election, how far you have approached these two countries.
Countries meaning US and Turkey, or?
No, you need the ratification from the United States and from Italy. And how are you negotiating? Do you get support from the United States?
US has already ratified, so.
And
yeah.
Italy too.
Italy too, yeah.
There are two, we're waiting for two countries, Turkey and Hungary. Hungary, so.
Yeah. Italians have already...
Yes,
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 yes.
yes, yes. Two.
The Italians did it before the elections. So it's...
France, how far do you see the chances of changing our constitution?
Well, I think you are putting your finger to the neutrality law. And I think it would be very difficult to find a majority, a two-thirds majority in the Austrian parliament that would be in favor of abolishing the law, the constitutional law of neutrality altogether. But there is a slow process of modification of our constitution. I mentioned the Lisbon Treaty, and in conjunction with the Lisbon Treaty, our constitution was amended. I refer to Article 23J, in which full participation in all activities of the European Common and Foreign Security is enshrined, which wipes out, I would say, a lot the meaning of neutrality, and the poor remnant of the neutrality law is the explicit prohibition to join a military alliance. So if we want to join NATO, in that case, we certainly would need to modify the neutrality or to abolish the neutrality law. And I'm afraid that at this point in time, as I'm speaking, you would not find a majority in favor of such an abolishing the neutrality law, in spite of the 24th of February this year.
Well, thank you. We have 3 more questions. Basically, it's already 4. You too? 5. So, are you first? Would you mind taking all these questions? And do you want to go ahead? Again, I repeat myself. The more questions, the less wine. If you know, that's the situation. If you're fine with this, then let's continue. Madam, please. Just a second, please.
I have only a brief question left, because the legal implications have already been touched upon. Our constitutions would have to be changed, apparently, if we give up our neutrality. But this neutrality was inscribed in our state treaty. Wouldn't have the signatories of the state treaty have to a word to say at least, or agree to giving up the neutrality?
Well, I think, okay, Franz.
Well, I can be very brief in answering your question. It is not correct to say that neutrality is enshrined in the state treaty. Of course, the conclusion of the state treaty has to be seen in connection with the adoption of the neutrality law, but the state treaty does not mention in a single article Austrian neutrality. So that could be left aside.
Next question, Thomas, please.
Just in defense of this idealization of neutrality, sacralization of neutrality, we have to be aware that this is, of course, closely connected with the process of Austria becoming a nation, a qualified independence from Germany. So this is, I think, one has to respect this and be aware of that. I have, in following up on what Minister Frischenschlager said, what about the United States? It's not in the future of the United States and the future role of the United States in NATO. It's not just Trump, but it's the American society at large, which since decades goes in the direction which will separate, widen the cleavage, the Atlantic cleavage, I think, and the readiness and of the United States to really fight abroad. That's one thing. That's the thing. And the second aspect, also I want to second Frischenschlager. And the second aspect, this is a question, also. This is the future of the U.S. relations with China. There's no question that this is for the United States. This is the central agenda, security agenda is China. Now, Europe is not on the same boat. We have difficulties with China, but it's not a direct security challenge. And if it would be a security challenge, it would not be a challenge which we would like to ward against together with the United States. We don't have the same policy. So I think that this is the two caveats on membership to the NATO, that we have to look into the future on these two questions too.
Well, I think maybe we can then all comment on this comment, because I think that's important. We have, please, ganz rechts. Gentleman over there.
Good afternoon. Madam Ambassador, you got me with the first page, a new aspect on European security. What I understood from all this, what I heard, is that the new aspect is a rather old aspect, that is the NATO. I don't want to open the can of worms, whether it's a good idea or not. Don't want that. But is your educated opinion that NATO is, for the time being, and perhaps for the future as well, for the short future or longer future as well, the best way to treat European security, or is there anything else behind?
It's the question to the three?
To the three, yeah.
To the three, okay. Would you comment, please?
Yeah, just to say that I know that at some point NATO was searching its soul. I mean, what's the thinking about 10, 15 years ago, and it was even called maybe even a peace organization, because it was pretty much in peacekeeping and concentrating on that side. But I think NATO now has found itself again, because this very let's say, unpredicted world and the security threats have been grown already for some time. And if we think what would be instead of NATO giving us, thinking about Finland, security, it's difficult to find at the moment anything which would replace NATO. And that is why I think in the end we decided to take the step and apply for the membership, when we noticed that the world around is unsecure, it's more unsecure, it's unpredictable, and we have a big neighbor which we can't really trust anymore. So that, I think that was very practical approach from our side as Finland in these circumstances. And if you look around, NATO is a security provider, a strongest alliance what we know when it comes to the security. So very simple thing in the end, how we saw that, why we need to take that step.
Finns are always very pragmatic. So please.
Yes, the same goes for Sweden. I mean, I have the parliamentary discussion, deliberations here, and all sorts of existing security and safety corporations are analyzed. So I don't want to speculate, but I don't think I am when I say the government, the social democratic government, didn't necessarily want to land in the conclusion that NATO membership was the best solution. I think all other options have been explored, including this.
Yes.
Well, I can only subscribe to what you said from my personal perspective, but I would like to add another aspect of this debate, namely that NATO is not an American-dominated monster, but it is an organization which comprises the wide majority of European states. So in that respect, NATO is also a European security organization, and it would be certainly wrong to decouple NATO and European Union. And I think they are not competitive organizations, but perhaps complementing each other in their respective capacities. So I think that it's a wrong track to play NATO against European Union, to separate European Union from the transatlantic security structures.
Well, allow me to comment here too, and refer to again what Metsola said today, and I try to quote it not word by word, but she said, countries or organizations that stand for our European values and rules-based international order, European values and rules-based international order shouldn't be regarded as competitors. And that's the point. So they complement each other, as Franz said. And I think if you look it up, it's quite an interesting formulation by this Maltese lady, President of the European Parliament. So it's I think it's the same what Franz just said. We have now finally some two young voices.
There's also there.
Sorry.
There's also one.
Where did I see anybody? Did I miss out? Okay, please. All right, good. Then, please. You too.
Hello, thank you very much for your comments and answers. It was already mentioned today that with the invasion to Ukraine, it was a drastic change and a difference in the basic security landscape in Europe, and but at the same time, these tendencies of changing the order, changing the structure has been already there before February, like maybe in 2014 or even earlier. And my question to you would be, how do you think, or what's your vision of the future of the European system in terms of security, with or without Russia, because it's still there, kind of, and you have to find a solution how to deal with that piece of land in the end. And the second point is, it was already mentioned that what is the alternative for NATO, and there is also a project of European Joint Army, which was somewhere discussed but not ever brought to like a real maybe debate. So maybe this is the time to like bring back to the agenda. From what's your opinion on that?
May I just try to unite the questions, please? Could you also have your question right away?
Hello, everyone. I'm John from also Turkey. As also Mr. Martin mentioned, that we are gonna hold elections next year, and it's out of question that Erdogan is going to convert Finland's willingness to join NATO as a domestic policy tool. Lastly, Turkish government asked like some 70 wanted people from both Sweden and Ukraine back to Turkey, but only a few of them could return. And besides other demands like stopping providing help and support to PKK, YPG, or FETÖ, like how do you approach Turkish government's demands on the way to NATO, joining NATO? And do you think that Turkish government will make enough pressure on the Finnish government, either at the end of this year or next year until the elections? Thank you.
Okay, please, question very far at the end, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Omar Yunus. I'm a doctoral student with the University of Vienna. My question is directed to Madam Ambassador of Sweden. So several days ago, I read an article by Professor Stefan Hedlund from Uppsala University, a professor of Russian studies. He wrote about the prospect of the Nordic bloc in NATO. He mentioned something like this, that the outlook for Nordic military-industrial cooperations is clouded by several reasons. One of them is Swedish, in his words, less than cordial relations with its neighbors. For example, there's a history of Norway and Finland deciding not to buy the Swedish Gripen fighters, and there was a previous, so to speak, failure of cooperation between Sweden and Norway in building a self-propelling howitzer together, and he mentioned that both left a bad impression on Sweden, and he also mentioned there's a strong presence of, well, there's a strong pro-Russia presence in the Swedish public atmosphere. Now, how would you respond to this sort of opinion? Thank you very much.
Fine, thank you. Please, maybe now I start first with Franz.
Well, on the last speak, I don't have anything to say. I am not really.
No, but on the other questions.
Well, I think that Thomas Novotny raised an important point, that we have to put this whole debate in a larger picture of US, European, China relations. It would be short-sighted just to limit this debate on the immediate developments. And here I'm very concerned about the focus of American politics on China, to be seen as the enemy number one. This is a very, very dangerous development in my situation, which puts into at a lower level European American relations. That is, I thank you very much for your pointing to this larger picture of world politics.
Please.
Yes, so I have understood 3 questions. The first one, what will happen to Russia and how do we deal with Russia? Yeah, I don't know. I don't think my government knows, but we can, of course, it's clear that Russia has developed into a systemic rival. to the world and the values that the European Union want to defend. And Russia is no longer a democracy but an autocracy, and that entails many difficulties. But where this will lead, I can't say. The second question concerning Turkey. Yes, Turkey has named a number of individuals that they wish extradited. Some of those are Swedish citizens, so by law that is not possible. And all these individual cases are decided by independent courts. So, and we have a different division of labor where all the courts, and not even the Minister of Justice, can interfere. It's not allowed. We have very small ministries and larger agencies, and the courts have a high degree of independency, so there can be no mixing of this. That's what I know, and this is what I hear. But it is true, and for instance, Sweden has been very clear that the PKK is categorized as a terrorist organization. It's also clear that some legal adjustments and legal modifications have been asked for by Turkey. They are also happening, but they were happening before, but they coincide in this. We do understand the concerns of Turkey with regard to the terrorist concerns. And the last question about arms exports and arms production within the framework of our future NATO membership. All I've heard is on this, that it is a subordinate, but of course a present question. For instance, would the rules of arms exports be altered to the favor of also Turkey in this regard? But what I don't know, and also in the European context, Sweden has a different setup because most of our arms exports are produced by private enterprises rather than, for instance, in France, where this is state-owned companies. So what it actually would mean, I don't know. I think that would be on a case-by-case issue. And I don't recognize the picture that we would have so strained relationship with the Nordic neighbors. Thank you.
Madam Ambassador.
Yeah. Concerning Russia, Russia has built together with the rest of the Europe the European security order, and it violated itself. I mean, I totally agree with my Swedish colleague that it's difficult to see the future and how Russia will be in Europe in the future, because I mean it's just impossible to see. And what is going to happen domestically there, and all these questions, how will Putin survive, and so forth and so forth. So all of this is really under the, well, I can't see. And I believe also my government can't see it either. So I wish I had a crystal ball. Turkey, I think in our discussions from Finnish point of view, we have acknowledged and understood the questions concerning terrorism and the concerns concerning concerns from Turkey, but. My understanding is that we have explained how also our judicial system is functioning is pretty much same, in fact, as in Sweden. And to my understanding, there are not so many demands concerning the extradition of people, if any, in our case. That now I don't know 100% this, but that is my understanding that there we are.
Thank you very much. Actors or singers at the end of the performance tend to say, you have been a wonderful public, a wonderful audience. Sie waren ein wunderbares Publikum. So thank you very much. You have been really a wonderful audience with your many questions. But your many questions only show that we need a discussion in Austria. and that we just cannot always, get this topic, as one says in German, just under the carpet. It just is impossible. And I know that we could have continued these discussions. I myself would have had many more questions. I have to thank especially our lady guests here from Sweden and from Finland, that you have explained to us the positions of your country in very clear words, understandable words, that I think is necessary for our own understanding of the situation, our own, if I may say so, digestion of this whole problematic that definitely needs further discussion, further internal discussion, and this discussion certainly will come. And one who will contribute to this further discussion, I expect, will be Franz Cede. So thank you very much, Franz, also for your participation. Thank you very much again. Please go to the just next door. There will be some wine. At 10 o'clock, this place will be closed. Thank you very much.